Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's great to have you here this morning. My name is Ian Watt, and I am the General Manager of the CMS Group. We're the company behind SmartSpec. And we're going to continue our next series in the H1 modules about achieving compliance. The last one we have with Auckland Council, extremely popular. There's a lot of focus on product-specific elements. And so we thought, given the volume of those questions that we've fielded, we would bring in a specific product manufacturer. So I'm very pleased to be joined here today by Todd Lindsay, the Building Performance and Technical Manager for Comfortech. Welcome, Todd, and thank you for your time today. Todd's going to kick things off with an overview about the impact of H1 compliance, the pathways, the solutions for ceilings and walls. And then at the end, we've had a whole raft of questions submitted via our website, via your registrations. Thank you very much for those. We're going to try and get through as many as we can. So we'll put those to Todd at the end of the presentation. So for now, I'd like to hand over to Todd to do his presentation. Thank you, Todd.
Thanks, Ian. Right, yeah, thanks. Talking about H1, obviously very topical at the moment with the changes now in full effect. The final changes happening around Windows as of November this year, but the rest of the legislation now fully in place. So going to go through what those changes all mean for you. Okay, so obviously the important thing, the H1, the schedule method, the table of required R values. So this is the H1 AS1 for buildings under 300 square metres, including all residential. And obviously some big changes there around the R values for ceilings and windows in particular. Walls have not changed much, and also with obviously floors moving quite a bit in R value, as well as breaking out timber floors from the concrete floors, which are historically combined into one value. So we'll go through how we achieve those values and what they all mean from a construction point of view. So the important thing to note with the H1 changes is that there are three compliance pathways. The one you're most familiar with, no doubt, will be the schedule method, which is basically taking those values off that table and applying those values to each element of your building. So the roof needs to be R6.6, the walls need to be R2, the floor needs to be R1.6, whatever, depending on what climate zones and things you're in. Alternatively, though, there are a couple of other methods of compliance, one being the calculation method. The calculation method varies in that it looks at heat loss. So rather than looking at purely R value or insulation construction values, it looks at the heat loss through the envelope. So we'll look at how much heat you lose through that roof, through that wall, through that window, through that floor. And as long as the overall amount of kilowatts of heat you lose through the envelope is less than the same house insulated to the schedule method, then you basically a pass for compliance with H1. And the third option for compliance is a more holistic view. It's the modelling method that actually looks at the overall energy use of the building. So it looks at how much energy it takes both to keep it warm in winter and cool in summer. So rather than just addressing heat loss, it looks at the overall performance of the building, gives you a much more nuanced evaluation of that performance and therefore a better quality building throughout the year. We are hoping that over time people will move much more towards the calculation and modelling method, because they are a much better solution than the schedule method, but understand that obviously initially, as people get their heads around these changes, the schedule method seems the obvious and easy path. But in reality, I think over time, people will realise the calculation method is the easiest, simplest, most straightforward compliance pathway. So looking at some of the solutions that we as a business, Comfortech, have developed for the H1, looking at our single layer ceiling insulation solution. So historically we've obviously supplied a lot of high R value insulation, R5, R6, R7 insulation into ceiling spaces, and traditionally that's been around the 432mm wide segment. But as obviously you can see in the image there on the right, there's a lot of congestion in that ceiling, and also a lot of thermal bridges with all those timber trusses running through. So if you threw a typical 432mm wide insulation into that ceiling space, you've still got a lot of thermal bridging with those truss boards and all those braces and rafters, and you can't just rely on that insulation to balloon out and seal those gaps. It's actually going to be tightly and snugly insulated. So what we do is we developed a range of solutions, including the Superbats range, which I'll talk about in a minute. So with a single layer 432 wire insulation, what you basically end up with, even with an R7, is only about 5.4 insulation construction R value. And that's because of that thermal bridging with all those timber members and the braces in that ceiling space. So basically, you can't rely on just an insulation push out between those truss cords to provide that insulation R value under the new code. So, and this is just showing also with the brands calculator. That previous one was Design Navigator. With the brands calculator as well, you're not actually achieving that 6.6 construction R value unless you actually are using overwidth insulation that is actually fitted around those timber members. You're falling short of that 6.6 construction R value. So our solution to address that concern around thermal bridging and the heat loss through those timber members is actually to recommend notching. So what we recommend is every second segment is actually notched out to fit around that truss board. And so what that means is you've completely sealed that thermal bridge. You haven't got any concerns about a lack of contact above that timber member, and you've got a full seal around that timber to ensure that there's no heat loss above that timber truss cord. The other thing to note as well, we do have in the SuperVats range a range of insulation products, not just R7. We also have an R6, an R5, and an R4.5, and that overwidth 460mm wide SuperVat range to allow you to achieve different R values under the different compliance pathways I touched on before. So this is Design Navigator, recently updated to include a tick box, which you tick if you are notching your insulation. And what it does is it basically increases that 5.39 construction R value up to 7.41 with the same insulation, but notched out around that truss board. So obviously a pretty strong endorsement of the fact that notching is the way to go when you're looking to remove that thermal pathway above that truss board. This is the brand's house insulation guide, which also notes that to achieve the correct overall construction R value, you should be cutting the insulation around that truss board to ensure that you completely seal that thermal bridge. So again, a good endorsement of the idea of notching by the house insulation guide from brands. We also developed a double layer solution. There was a lot of talk initially in the changes with the H1 to go to a 2-layer R3.6 insulation, which is a logical enough pathway to go down. We have a couple of concerns about 2 layers of R3.6. The first one being a R3.6 insulation is generally about 180mm thick. Truss cords are generally about 90mm or 140mm thick. High, I should say. So therefore, with a 180mm thick insulation either side of that truss cord, you've got a large air gap over that truss cord. So you've got a path for heat flow, heat loss, air movement over that truss cord. Even if you insulate over the top of the second layer, you're not completely sealing that pathway. The other concern is that when you put a second layer of insulation on top of that first layer, you're also compressing it. So it might start off as an R3.6, but under compression, it could drop significantly, depending on the density and weight of that second layer. So you may not really actually achieve that 6.6 construction at the end of the day. So our solution as a 2-layer solution is actually to develop a high density first layer. And that first layer is 110mm high, which is designed to be the same height as the height from the top of the ceiling battens to the top of the truss board. So in the instance of a 90mm truss, we land there on 110mm, and a 140mm truss, we land there on 160mm to land at the top of that truss cord. And what that means is that when you put that second layer on top, you haven't got that air gap over that truss cord. And the other innovation that we brought to the market was that first layer being a much higher density than your standard 2.6 insulation. So therefore the compression of that second layer doesn't impact on it. Typically that second layer would be an R4.5 to give you that R6.6 construction, but we do have other options you can use as that second layer if you don't need to have that 6.6 construction because of your compliance pathway. And this is just, again, showing the endorsement by the industry. This is the brand's house insulation guide, where they talk about 2 layers of insulation with the first layer or lower layer in the exact thickness of the truss cord. So again, that's endorsing that idea of not putting a 180mm thick insulation alongside a 90mm truss cord and leaving that air gap. And with that solution, you achieve well over that 6.6 construction R value. The other big challenge with the new H1 changes is obviously how do you put all that insulation into a pitched roof where you've got compression at the edge of the roof with the insulation thickness. How do you address that? We know from the new H1 that you can reduce the construction R value at the perimeter of the roof to 3.3 from 6.6 under either the schedule or the calculation method. But that construction R value of 3.3 is not the insulation R value. The insulation R value needs to be higher because you need to allow for that thermal bridging from those truss boards. So we know from brands' previous work they've done that construction R value of 3.3 needs at least an R3.5 insulation, assuming truss cords at 900 centres to achieve that 3.3 construction. And so obviously, again, logically, the first thing the industry pivoted to was raised heel trusses. Raised heel trusses do solve that problem. They eliminate the need for any sort of compression or reduction in insulation, but they have big cost implications around maybe 10% more cladding, height in relation to boundary challenges and that sort of thing. So great practical solution from the insulation point of view, but not great from the point of view of the overall size and quality of the house you're delivering, if you like. If you can avoid raised heel trusses, why wouldn't you? So we went down that pathway. We spoke to the industry and they said, look, we want to avoid raised heel trusses on roofs with at least a 20-degree roof pitching above. That's the main area of the market. So can you develop us a solution where we can actually not have a raised heel on a 20-degree pitch roof? So we looked at how do we compress our pink bats, super bats insulation to allow us to not need to do a raised heel. And so we did a lot of testing of our insulation products under compression to see what we needed to have in the way of a construction R value or a product R value to achieve the construction R value of 3.3 at the perimeter under compression. And also keeping in mind the requirements of 4246 around the 20 mil, 25 mil air gap over that insulation as well, how we can maintain those pathways as well. So we ended up with a product, a roll panel vent product available from a company called Dry Space here in New Zealand. That product is actually installed over the truss cords under the purlins before the roof underlay and the roof goes on. And then you're actually able to push the insulation up against the roll panel vent over the top of that top plate at the perimeter of the roof, compressing the insulation, and you're still able to achieve that 3.3 construction R value. And again, just noting, we do have other super bat products in that overwidth product, and the lower R values of R6, R5, and 4.5 as well, if you're going via different compliance pathways. We also developed a two-layer version I touched on before, the 110mm thick first layer, and then in this case, our 4.5 second layer. The thing to note with the two-layer solution from Comfortech as well is that two-layer, the second layer drops down to be the first layer at the perimeter. So the first layer at the perimeter is actually a 4.5, not a 2.6. The reason it's a 4.5 is when you're compressing insulation, you do lose R value. It depends on the density of the R value, how much you lose. Density of insulation, but in the case of the R4.5, when that's compressed down at the perimeter, they're still able to achieve the R3.6 product R value, so the 3.3 construction R value, which we wouldn't be able to achieve with the R3.6 insulation under compression. And this is something we developed with Albrecht Stockline at Design Navigator. We actually developed a edge compression calculator. So we took all our SuperVats product and we compressed it down to about 100 millimeters in height, and we worked out what the actual construction R value was at that height. And then we were able to use Albrecht's expertise to develop this spreadsheet, so we can input in the spreadsheet the degree of roof pitch, the amount of raised heel starting at 0, the inclusion of the roll panel vent for the ventilation pathway to give us the overall construction R value under compression over that perimeter area of the roof. So we can demonstrate very easily that we are achieving that 3.3 construction with our various SuperVat products under compression at the roof perimeter. Skillion roofs are another big challenge, an area where we get a lot of questions. So we've got a couple of solutions for Skillion roofs. We've got a single layer and a two-layer solution. So if you had 290mm deep rafters, we've got an R7.4 product, in the SuperVats range, which at 275mm thick will fit in between those 290 rafters and allow the ventilation pathway required by 4246 to be achieved and achieve that 6.6 construction. If you have a 240 rafter, we have a R6 at 235mm thick, and then a second layer R1, which goes in between the battens underneath the rafters to again deliver that 6.6 construction, while still meeting the requirements of NZS 4246. And this is just showing the brand's insulation, house insulation guide, just showing that information around the 290 rafter and R7.4 SuperVat, achieving that 6.6 construction. And then Design Navigator here just showing the two-layer solution with two 40mm rafters and the second layer of R1 achieving that 6.6 construction under Design Navigator for a Skillion roof. All right, now looking at walls. Walls are another big challenge, as I sort of touched on at the beginning. Walls haven't moved too much. Walls have only got from 1.9 to R2, and that's nationally, so no changes by climate zone. However, we know that there was a study done a couple of years ago now by Brands and Beacon Pathway, where they actually looked at the amount of framing in the walls of new builds. They looked at about 350 houses, I think it was, around the Upper North Island. They found the average amount of framing in those walls was around 34%. That was down as low as about 24% and as high as about 51, 52%. So we know with an average amount of framing percentage of 34%, that's well above the 12 to 18% we've always assumed under the old H1 for the amount of framing we need to allow for thermal bridging. That has obviously major implications as far as construction R values, as I touched on before. Basically, we need to be considering what we're actually delivering under the code as far as construction R values, not the assumptions under the code. So currently under H1, it only requires you to allow for the top plate, bottom plate, studs and knobs and dwangs. There's no additional allowance required for knobs, for lintels or double studs, jack studs, and all the additional framing we know goes into a typical wall. As you can see in those typical wall shots and those bottom three images there's a lot more framing in an actual wall than maybe might be designed into that wall and on the drawing board. So we need to start considering the amount of thermal bridging and how we get around that. So this is just an innovation that brands have come out with their house insulation guide. This allows you, rather than making assumptions on the amount of framing in the wall, to actually input the actual amount of framing in the wall. And what this actually demonstrates with the house insulation guide wall calculator is that if you had 24% framing in your wall, and you're putting R2.8 pink that insulation into that wall frame, you're only just achieving that R2 construction R value. So we could obviously still continue to assume that's between 12 and 18%, chuck an R2.6 or an R2.8 into the wall and say, yeah, we're all good, we're fine, we're meeting the code. And in reality, as far as the legislation goes, you are. But it's kind of like our position on the notching of insulation. We could say just ballooning over the truss cords and you'll be right, but we know that there's always, it relies a lot on install, it relies a lot on assumptions. So we've decided that even with wall insulation, you really need to make sure you're actually achieving the intention of the code rather than just ticking the box. So like notching, with wall construction, we're saying be very careful about your framing percentages. Be aware that if you've got more than 24% framing in your wall, in R2.8, will not necessarily get you over the line for that R2 construction R value. So you may need to look at other solutions. So obviously the industry has acknowledged there is an issue in this area, and there's some really good things happening in the industry around addressing this concern. One of them is that placemakers with their framology system, they're now able to offer you an actual framing percentage in your prenatal frame walls. So whereas, as I touched on before, assumptions of 12 and 18, between 12 and 18% insulation, 12 and 18% framing in your walls, placemakers framology can now tell you that in actual fact you've actually got 35% framing in that wall. So you'll know, therefore, you need to consider other methods of compliance to ensure that you actually hit that R2 construction R value. They're also looking at other innovations around knobless framing, so removing knobs from framed walls, and also potentially looking at thermally broken rad boards and things like that to basically address some of that heat loss through that framing as well. So there's some really good innovations coming through in the industry, following on from a position we've taken where we're saying, look, we know what the legislation says, but we also know what the legislation intends, and we want to deliver what the legislation intends rather than just what it says. We want to deliver really well-performing buildings over the life of that building, not just tick the box for a compliance under the consent application process. The other innovation that is on the horizon, where we're working with a supplier out of Europe around wood fibre insulation, and we do see continuous external insulation generally as being another good option for addressing that thermal bridging through framing. So where you have got more than 24% framing, certainly a consideration to look at something like a wood fibre or some other sort of rigid board product outside that frame to address that heat loss through that framing. The other alternative, of course, is a continuous insulation on the inside of the frame. Within our range, we have the Comfortech cool firm insulated plasterboard option, which again addresses thermal bridging, but from the inside of the frame. So just touching briefly on large buildings. Large buildings generally are probably modelled by specialist consultants, so you tend to have a more upfront, nuanced conversation around achieving those R values. But a few things to note: the R values under the buildings over 300 square metres and non-residential have increased also significantly, with as high as R7 in Zone 6 for roofs, and some big improvements in wall R values from around 0.4 to up to 2.2, 3.2, even in the lower South Island for walls, and obviously some changes as well with underfloor, or to reduce that energy use in construction. We know that the goals of the H1 changes are 40% reduction in energy use in residential buildings and 23% in commercial buildings. So we're not going to get there without increasing the thermal performance of those envelopes. So just looking at a couple of the key changes for the H1 AS2 for buildings over 300 square metres. You've got the same compliance pathways, but there are a few differences. With the schedule method under the H1 AS2 for buildings over 300 square metres, you can use the schedule method with up to 50% window and door area in your walls, whereas it's only 30% for the schedule method under H1 AS1 for buildings under 300 square metres in residential. So that's a big change. It also does, the calculation method also does not allow you to reduce the schedule method R value for your roofs and windows and skylights under your proposed building with the calculation method, whereas under the calculation method under the AS1 you can actually reduce the R values of all your building elements. So there are some limitations with the large buildings changes with AS2. The other consideration as well, a question that comes up a lot actually around my building's 500 square metres, but there's only 150 square metres of office. Well, if your overall building is over 300 square metres, that's the criteria as to whether you go to AS1 or AS2. It doesn't matter how big the element or component of the building is that you're actually looking to model. It's the overall size of the building that matters. So a 500 square metre building with a 150 square metre office still needs to be modelled under AS2, not AS1. And so, yeah, around solutions for these large buildings within the Comfortech range, we've obviously got the Pink Bats VIV product range for your roofing applications. We've also got the Kingspan Cool Firm K10, K12, K17 products for various applications. And we've got obviously for walls, we've got the Pink Bats up to 4.3 and 140mm walls. And we've got again the Kingspan Cool Firm and the Comfortech Cool Firm insulated plasterboard for concrete walls and that sort of thing. So a range of solutions that we can help you with those commercial wall applications and commercial roof applications as well. So just to finish off, all this information I've touched on today is covered in a lot more detail on our website, h1done.co.nz. You can see lots more videos of me talking about various things, such as why we recommend notching, why we don't recommend 2 layers of R3.6, what work has been done by Design Navigator and brands around H1 compliance and how you can use their tools to support you, and a lot of information on product and all our solutions that I've touched on today as well. So we certainly encourage you to go to h1done.co.nz. And that is all from me, and that's my overview of H1.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Todd, for doing that. A lot of questions answered there. I was just going through the questions as we received them. You've answered many of them, but I will put some of the remaining ones to Todd now. I'm going to apologise in advance if we don't get to your questions, because we did receive a lot, and some probably really relate to other webinars that will be presented in this series for other product areas. One of the most popular ones we got there, Todd, was query around renovation work. So where you've got an existing dwelling joining onto an extension or something of a house, so you've got a mixture of the existing with the new, and what the requirements are there around where the two meet. Yes.
Yep, sure. Yep. So under the new H1, I think it's pretty much the same as under the old H1. The overall rule of thumb is you cannot make the overall building perform any worse than it was before. So any new elements to that extension or renovation need to meet the new H1. Any existing parts of the building only need to perform no worse than they did prior. So you have an existing part of a house and you're adding a room on. If you're putting in a larger window, then that larger window may potentially negatively impact on the thermal performance of that envelope compared to the wall before. And so therefore you need to offset that heat loss with an improvement in the insulation around that window and that wall. But if the window you're putting in performs better overall than the what was there before, you don't need to do anything additional. So the rule of thumb with existing construction is making it no worse than it was before, and any new elements of construction added to that building need to meet the new H1 requirements.
Okay, thank you. Another question here, is it possible to increase areas of insulation in order to have slightly less in other areas, but you're achieving the rating overall?
Absolutely. So that's the calculation method primarily. So basically you can reduce your roof construction R value from say a 6.6 to maybe an R5, but you offset that with having a really high performing windows. Maybe you go to an R4.3 pink bats in your walls to give you an R3 constructing R value in your walls rather than the required R2, which means that you're trading off that ceiling R value with your wall R value, and that may actually give you a better performing building overall. You won't have necessarily overheating potential in summer. You'll balance out the performance of the building better throughout the year.
Okay, cool. How do we show compliance of the R value to the BCAs?
Yep. So I touched on a couple of the platforms that are available. So you've got Design Navigator, which has been around a long time, well proven, very, very helpful, very useful platform, and you can certainly model all sorts of different constructions in there, as well as going as far as getting involved in whole of house modelling or whole of building modelling. And Albrecht is obviously only just got an email away to help you work through that. And also the house insulation guide from Brands also enables you to model the different building elements to demonstrate the overall construction of the different elements of your house through that. And then there's other people such as Speckle who can help you with full-on sort of modelling of your building or your house to demonstrate that compliance. But all those methodologies are accepted by council.
And I guess those platforms, we've got a question here about those platforms will be relevant around calculating the R values for compressed insulation. You spoke about Design Navigator, that takes that into consideration, is it?
Yeah, look, Brands actually have on their house insulation guide an edge compression calculator, which uses similar sort of methodology to the calculator we developed with Albrecht from Design Navigator. Yeah, we developed our calculator, we actually compressed our insulation. So we've got our calculator is based on actual performance data of our insulation. The Brands one makes assumptions based on 4214 around compression. So there are some slight differences based on our actual product data versus the industry assumptions. But yeah, there is ways to demonstrate the compliance of the insulation via compression. At that edge. It's actually an innovation for the industry that we sort of drove early on, but it's a great solution, a way to avoid race hill trusses.
Okay. Can the calculation method be used to reduce the requirement for 6.6 in ceilings if the walls and floor values compensate? Yeah,
that's exactly. I touched on that, I think, before a little bit. That's the calculation method. So absolutely, you can achieve, say, R5 in your ceiling and go to an R3 in your walls, construction R value. So offsetting that drop in construction R value. So yeah, get the overall heat loss value below the same building via the schedule method.
And obviously you touched on Skillion roofs and rafters. We got a host of questions around that. One of the ones here was, instead of a 190 by 45 rafter, do you need a 290 by 45 for the air gap required to fit that insulation in? Yeah,
that's a great question. I mean, we've developed some new Superbat Skillion roof products. So our Superbat Skillion roof product is actually 560 millimeters wide rather than the typical 430. One of the reasons we did that is we did talk to the industry about the most common spacing for rafters and Skillion roofs, and we actually found that at least 50% of the industry is doing Skillion roofs at 600 centres rather than 450. So we've got our Skillion roof at 560 wide now. And those products are a little, because of our higher R values, we're an R6 product, Superbat Skillion product, which is a 230 millimeters high. So that goes into a 240 mil high rafter. That does only leave a 10 millimeter gap to the underside of the purlin. But under 4246, the requirement is just a 25 mil air gap from the underside of the roof underlay to the top of the insulation. It's not a requirement from the underside of the purlin to the top of the insulation. And we have consulted with industry, and with that 10 millimeter air gap underneath the purlin, plus the 35 millimeter air gap between the purlins to the underside of the underlay, we are meeting the requirements of 4246 around that ventilation pathway, because the 4246 really just addresses the concern about over recovery of insulation and contact between the insulation and the roof underlay, as opposed to that actually addressing a 25 mil ventilation pathway across that Skillion.
Hey, thanks very much, Todd. I think we've answered most of the other questions that we did receive in various forms. There was a lot around personal projects, so we won't get into some of those, but certainly if you have any questions, this webinar recording will be available on the SmartSpec website. It'll also be available on Comfortech website. Todd spoke about the individual videos for some of the components for what he presented, and Todd or his team are more than happy to answer any questions that you may have around your specific developments. So I want to thank you for coming in today. A very informative, fantastic presentation. I think I answered, as I say, a lot of people's questions out there. So I really hope you found it useful. Next webinar in this series will cover floor slabs and foundations. So look out for an invitation for that one coming up shortly. I want to thank you for your time today. Until we speak again next time, goodbye for now. Have a great day.